The sign outside flickered, its letters spelling out the velvet veil in dim orange light, barely visible through the thick fog rolling off the streets of Chicago. It was Halloween night, 1931, and beneath the noise of rumbling streetcars and the distant hum of police sirens, a different world thrived in secret. Tom Malone, bartender and reluctant guardian of this underground refuge, leaned against the bar, wiping down glasses that didn't need wiping. His eyes scanned the room, soaking in the typical sights of another roaring night. The usual suspects filled the room, men in tailored suits sitting with women draped in sequins, laughing too loud over the smooth jazz drifting from the corner stage. Prohibition had turned the night into a thing of rebellion, and here in the Velvet Veil, no one cared about the law. Only the whiskey mattered. And of course, the privacy. Tom sighed, glancing at the old grandfather clock tucked away in the corner. It was nearing 11, and the crowd was as wild as ever. Flappers danced with reckless abandon in the hazy glow of cigarette smoke, their beaded dresses shimmering under the low, warm light of crystal chandeliers. The piano's melancholic tune mingled with the chatter, creating a soothing dissonance that had become a strange comfort to Tom over the years. He'd been behind this bar since the joint opened, and nothing surprised him anymore. At least, not until tonight. The doors creaked open, though nobody seemed to notice. At first glance, the woman who entered didn't stand out. Her black dress was simple but elegant, more subdued than the glittering crowd. A wide-brimmed hat veiled her face in shadow. But as she moved deeper into the room, Tom felt a shift. It was subtle, like a sudden drop in temperature, the kind that crawled beneath your skin. The woman moved with an unsettling grace, her presence at odds with the raucous energy of the room. She didn't head for the tables, didn't acknowledge the patrons dancing just feet away from her. Instead, she walked straight to the bar, taking a seat at the far end, where the shadows of the dim light were thickest. Her hand rested on the counter, delicate, pale fingers tipped with blood-red nails. Tom hesitated, watching her from the corner of his eye as he finished pouring a drink for a regular. She sat motionless, her face obscured by the brim of her hat. It was as if she was waiting for him to come to her. Finally, unable to shake the strange sense of obligation she cast over him, Tom set down the glass he was holding and made his way toward her. His footsteps seemed to echo louder than usual in the quiet that now felt too thick, like the air was soaked in something heavy. "What can I get you?" he asked, his voice a little rougher than usual. She didn't look up immediately, just let her fingers trace a slow circle on the bar surface. "Something special," she said, her voice soft but laced with a curious depth that sent a shiver through Tom's spine. Tom frowned. "We've got everything you could want, but it's all pretty standard. Depends what you mean by special." She lifted her head slightly, just enough for her lips to curl into a smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Not on your menu." Tom's fingers tightened around the rag in his hand. Something about her didn't sit right, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "You'll have to be more specific," he said. Slowly, she pulled a small vial from the folds of her dress, setting it on the bar between them. The liquid inside was a deep, iridescent purple, catching the low light like it had a life of its own. "This is what I want," she said. "And I can make sure you want it, too." Tom stared at the vial, his heartbeat quickening despite his attempts to remain calm. He'd seen plenty of strange things over the years, but this was something else. "Lady," he began, his voice low, "I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but we don't sell potions here." Her smile widened, though her eyes remained hidden in the shadow of her hat. "Oh, this isn't for sale. It's an offering. Just one sip and everything you've ever feared will vanish. You, Tom Malone, will never have to worry about dying again." Tom's blood turned cold. He hadn't told her his name. "I'll be back when the hour strikes 12, she said, rising from her seat. "Think it over." Before he could respond, she slipped back into the crowd, disappearing into the smoke and shadows, as if she'd never been there at all. Tom wiped his hands on his apron, staring at the spot where the woman had sat just moments before. The vial she left behind shimmered under the low light, its dark, swirling contents catching his eye every time he tried to look away. His fingers itched to grab it, to hold it up to the light and see if it was as dangerous as it looked. But something inside him, something deeper than instinct, told him to leave it alone. The room buzzed with life around him, but it felt distant, like a dream just out of reach. The flappers still danced, their laughter sharp and carefree. The jazz band played on, the saxophone's wail rising above the chatter. But none of it pierced through the fog clouding his mind. Tom had seen all types walk into the Velvet Veil. Gangsters with blood on their hands, lovers with secrets buried deep, desperate men looking to drown their sins in bootleg whiskey. But she wasn't like any of them. Her words replayed in his mind over and over again. "You will never have to worry about dying again." He snatched the vial off the bar and shoved it into his pocket, hoping to erase the strange pull it had over him. Just as he did, a familiar face approached. Danny Wilcox, one of the regulars. Danny was a small-time crook, a man who fancied himself more dangerous than he actually was. He slid onto a bar stool, his slicked-back hair shining under the dim chandelier. "Tommy, my man." Danny greeted him with a grin, knocking on the bar with his ringed knuckles. "Pour me a double, would ya? Feels like a night for celebrating." Tom nodded absent-mindedly, grabbing a bottle of bourbon and pouring it into a glass. His mind was still on the woman, her offer gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Danny's voice cut through the haze. "Hey, you all right, pal? You look like you've seen a ghost." Tom shook his head. "Nah, just some strange business." Danny raised an eyebrow. "Strange? In this place? Now that's saying something." Tom slid the bourbon across the bar, watching as Danny downed it in one gulp. He knew he shouldn't bring it up, knew how fast rumors could spread in a place like the Velvet Veil. But the weight of the vial in his pocket felt like a lead weight, pulling the words out of him. "There was this woman," Tom began, leaning in a little closer. "She came in a few minutes ago, offered me something off. A drink, but not the kind we serve here. Said it could make me immortal." Danny chuckled, his grin widening as if Tom had just told the punchline to a joke. "Immortal, huh? That sounds like a pitch from one of those snake oil salesmen." Tom didn't laugh. He pulled the vial from his pocket, holding it up just enough for Danny to see. The purple liquid seemed to pulse under the bar's soft glow, casting a strange reflection on the polished wood. Danny's smile faded. "What in the hell is that?" "She said one sip, and I'd never die," Tom said, lowering his voice to a whisper. "But there's a price." Danny stared at the vial, his fingers twitching on the bar as if he wanted to reach for it, but didn't quite have the nerve. "What kind of price?" Tom shook his head. "She didn't say. Just that it's higher than death." The two men sat in silence for a long moment, the energy of the speakeasy fading into the background. Danny's eyes were glued to the vial, curiosity and fear playing across his face. After a minute, he licked his lips and leaned closer. "And you believe her?" "I don't know what I believe," Tom admitted. "But it doesn't feel right." Danny's gaze flicked between Tom and the vial. "You didn't drink it, did you?" Tom let out a bitter laugh. "No, I ain't stupid." "Well, if you're not gonna try it, maybe we should let someone else have a go," Danny suggested, his voice light but his eyes too eager. "Could be worth something, you know? People pay a lot for promises." Before Tom could respond, a voice cut through their conversation. It was smooth, almost lyrical, with a hint of danger beneath it. "What's that you're talking about, fellas?" Tom and Danny both turned to see Frankie Malone, Tom's younger brother, sauntering toward them. Frankie was trouble, always had been. He was slick, dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, his dark hair neatly combed back. But Tom could see the tension in his shoulders, the restless energy that meant Frankie was up to no good. Again. "Just a little business, Frankie. Nothing you need to worry about," Tom said, his voice tight. Frankie's sharp eyes caught the glint of the vial in Tom's hand. "That wouldn't happen to be the business, would it?" he asked, leaning on the bar with a sly grin. "Looks like you're holding something mighty valuable." Tom tucked the vial back into his pocket, scowling. "Stay out of it, Frankie." But the seed had been planted, and Tom could already see the wheels turning in his brother's mind. Frankie was always chasing a fast way out, and this was the kind of opportunity he'd kill for. As Frankie sauntered off, Tom's gut twisted. Whatever this was, it wasn't just dangerous. It was alive, and it was starting to spread. The hours dragged by in a haze of smoke and jazz, but Tom couldn't shake the nagging thought of the vial burning a hole in his pocket. It sat there humming with its dark promise, while the speakeasy swirled around him in a blur of noise and drink. Every time he poured a glass or handed over a shot, he thought about that shimmering liquid, the way it seemed to glow as if it had a life of its own. He knew he shouldn't tell anyone else about it, but the thought had already slipped free like a bad idea he couldn't rein back in. Danny had heard, and so had Frankie, and in a place like the Velvet Veil, secrets didn't last long. He could already feel the hungry eyes, see the subtle glances thrown his way by the regulars. Word was getting around, and that was the last thing he needed. The place had grown quieter, though not in a way that felt safe. It was the kind of quiet that comes when people are watching, waiting for something to happen. The band still played, but their music seemed distant, the lively notes of the saxophone lost in the tense air that hung thick in the room. Tom wiped down the bar, his movements stiff, his mind running in circles. What was this feeling? Then the sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. Tom looked up to see Danny, already flushed from the bourbon, leaning over the bar again. "So," Danny said, his voice low, "you given it any more thought?" Tom's eyes narrowed. "About what?" Danny scoffed. "Don't play dumb with me, Tommy. That stuff in your pocket. You've got something real powerful there and you're just letting it sit? Hell, I bet half the guys in here would kill for a shot at immortality." Tom's jaw clenched. "You don't know what you're talking about. There's a catch, Danny. A big one, I can feel it." Danny waved a hand dismissively. "Come on, we all got a price. I'd rather gamble with immortality than worry about catching a bullet in the back." His grin widened as he leaned closer. "You don't want to live forever? Imagine it, never getting old, never having to look over your shoulder. You'd be untouchable." Tom's stomach twisted. He couldn't deny the temptation gnawing at him. The thought of it, the thought of living without fear of death, was seductive. He'd seen too many men gunned down in the streets, too many lives cut short by the ruthless grind of this city. But that woman, something about her words kept replaying in his mind. The price wasn't just high, it was worse than death. "Why don't you try it then?" Tom said, tossing the challenge at Danny. "If you think it's such a great deal." Danny's eyes flashed with greed, but he hesitated. He ran a hand through his hair and shrugged. "I mean, maybe. But what if it's a scam? That's the thing. You're the one who's got to test it out first. See if it's the real deal. Then maybe the rest of us will give it a go." Tom laughed bitterly. "I'm not your guinea pig, Danny. Whatever this is, it's not just some cheap trick. There's something dark in it, something I don't want to mess with." Before Danny could respond, the door swung open again. In walked a man Tom didn't recognize. He wasn't like the usual patrons, a bit too polished with a slick, predatory look in his eyes. He scanned the room, his gaze sharp as a knife, and then made a beeline straight for Tom. The man's eyes locked onto Tom's, and in an instant, Tom knew he was looking for the vial. There was a hunger in the stranger's gaze, the kind that comes from desperation. Tom instinctively shifted, putting his back to the bar, guarding the pocket where the vial rested. The man slid onto a bar stool, his smile too smooth to be genuine. "I hear you've got something special," he said, his voice dripping with false charm. Tom shot Danny a glare. Word was already spreading faster than he thought. "Don't know what you're talking about," Tom said, his voice tight. The man's smile faltered just for a second, but long enough for Tom to catch the flicker of frustration. "I'm not here to play games, friend. I'm willing to pay. Whatever it takes. Just one sip. That's all I'm asking." Tom's heart pounded in his chest. The room felt smaller, the shadows thicker. I said, "I don't know what you're talking about." The stranger's hand twitched toward his coat pocket, and Tom caught a glimpse of something metal. A gun, maybe. He wasn't sure, but the threat was there, hanging between them. Before the situation could escalate, Frankie's voice cut through the tension. "Hey, pal. You heard my brother. No deals tonight. Now why don't you move along?" Frankie stepped up beside Tom, his eyes glinting with mischief and danger. As much trouble as Frankie was, Tom felt a sliver of relief. At least he had backup. The stranger stared at them both for a long moment before backing down, his expression twisting into something uglier than before. "This ain't over," he muttered, slipping off the stool and disappearing into the smoky haze of the speakeasy. Tom exhaled, his fingers tightening around the bar. The stranger was right. This wasn't over. The temptation had only just begun. Midnight was creeping closer, and with it came a growing sense of dread that hung in the air like a thick fog. Tom had been glancing at the clock all night, watching the minutes tick down toward the witch's promised return. The unease in his gut had settled into something heavier, something close to fear. The vial felt colder in his pocket, like it was leaching heat from his body. Every time he thought about pulling it out, something stopped him. But the others weren't so hesitant. Danny, for one, had been circling the bar like a restless predator. His eyes kept darting toward Tom's pocket, his voice edging into a manic excitement whenever the subject of the vial came up. And he wasn't alone. Word had spread faster than a whisper in a graveyard, and now several of the regulars had heard about the supposed witch's brew. Greedy eyes followed Tom wherever he went, though no one dared to make a move. Yet, Tom could feel the tension growing, like a coiled spring ready to snap. Then it did. It was Hank Mitchell, the factory worker who spent more time drowning his paycheck in whiskey than taking it home to his family. Hank wasn't the smartest man in the room, but he was stubborn, and the moment the idea of immortality took root in his mind, There was no stopping him. His once pale face had flushed with drink and anticipation as he staggered up to the bar, slamming his fist down hard enough to rattle the glasses. "Tom," Hank slurred, his eyes wide and crazed. "I ain't waiting no more. You're sitting on something big, and I want to taste it." Tom froze, his fingers tightening around the edge of the bar. "Hank, listen. This ain't for you. You don't know what you're asking." "I know damn well what I'm asking," Hank shot back, his voice loud enough to draw attention from the rest of the speakeasy. "I ain't got nothing to lose. If this stuff works, I'll live forever. And if it don't, well, I'll be no worse off than I am now." Tom's stomach churned. "You don't understand. She said there's a price, Hank. One you don't want to pay." But Hank wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the pocket where the vial sat, and Tom knew there was no reasoning with him. Hank leaned in closer, his breath thick with alcohol. "I ain't scared of no price. Give me that vial, Tom." A heavy silence fell over the room as all eyes turned toward the confrontation. The band had stopped playing, the music replaced by the crackling tension in the air. Tom hesitated, his mind racing. If he gave Hank the vial, it could doom them all. But if he refused, things could turn ugly fast. Before he could make a decision, Danny stepped in, his grin wide and reckless. "Come on, Tommy. Let the man have a taste. We're all curious, aren't we?" The crowd murmured in agreement, and Tom realized just how far things had spiraled out of control. This wasn't a private secret anymore. It had become something much darker. The room was turning against him, and there was only one way to defuse the situation. With a heavy heart, Tom pulled the vial from his pocket. The liquid inside seemed to pulse in the low light, casting an eerie glow that flickered across the room. Hank's eyes widened with awe as he reached for it, trembling with excitement. Tom held it back for a moment, locking eyes with Hank. "I'm telling you, Hank, this is a bad idea. Don't do it." But Hank was beyond reason. "I'll take my chances." Reluctantly, Tom handed over the vial. Hank snatched it up, popping the cork with shaking hands. The liquid inside seemed to swirl and shimmer as if it was alive. Without hesitation, Hank tipped the vial back and took a long, deep gulp. For a moment, nothing happened. Hank stood there, blinking, as if waiting for some grand transformation. The crowd leaned in, holding their breath, waiting for the impossible. Then it hit. Hank's face twisted in pain, his body convulsing as he staggered backward. His skin seemed to ripple, shifting like something was crawling beneath it. The crowd gasped, stepping back as Hank let out a guttural scream, dropping the vial to the floor where it shattered into 1,000 pieces. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he watched in horror. Hank's body began to change, his posture straightening, his skin smoothing out as the years melted away. His thinning hair thickened, turning dark again. He looked younger, stronger, but there was something wrong. His eyes, once full of life, were now empty, hollow. The crowd watched in stunned silence as Hank stood there, breathing heavily, his transformation complete. He looked down at his hands, marveling at his newfound youth, but the eerie glow in his eyes betrayed the truth. He was no longer Hank, not really. The man who had stood at the bar moments ago was gone, replaced by something else, something soulless. The crowd erupted into chaos, people shouting, pushing, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. But Tom could only stand there, staring at what remained of Hank. The price had been paid, just as the witch had warned. And now there was no turning back. Tom's breath caught in his throat as Hank stood before them, youthful and unrecognizable, except for his eyes. Those hollow, glassy orbs stared into nothing, void of any spark of life. The crowd around him shuffled nervously, the initial awe giving way to a creeping dread. It was as though everyone sensed something was wrong but couldn't articulate it. Danny stepped forward, a wide grin stretching across his face. "Would you look at that? Hank, you look incredible." His voice was full of nervous excitement, but even he hesitated before getting too close. Hank didn't respond. He kept turning his hands over, marveling at his restored youth. The transformation had been physical, sure, but there was something more. Something darker lurking beneath his skin. His breathing was shallow, mechanical, as if he were going through the motions of life without understanding what it meant to live. Tom wiped a cold sweat from his brow, feeling the weight of what had just happened sink into his bones. This was no miracle. The price of the witch's brew was real, and they were starting to see it. Hank had been given eternal youth, but at what cost? "Hank?" Tom ventured, his voice unsteady. "You all right?" Hank's head jerked up as if hearing Tom's voice for the first time. His gaze locked onto Tom, but there was no recognition in his eyes. He stared blankly like a puppet waiting for its next command. The silence was unbearable. Then, without warning, Hank let out a low growl, the sound so unnatural that it made the hair on Tom's neck stand up. I feel powerful," Hank finally said, his voice flat, robotic. He took a step forward, his movements stiff, almost mechanical. His eyes scanned the room, but they weren't the eyes of a man. They were the eyes of something else, something that no longer cared about humanity or connection. The crowd began to murmur nervously, stepping back as Hank's presence grew more unsettling. Danny, still trying to push through the fear, reached out to clap a hand on Hank's shoulder. "Well, look at you. We're all gonna want a taste of that stuff, huh?" But as Danny's hand touched Hank's shoulder, the transformation became clear. Hank whipped his head toward Danny with lightning speed, his face twisting into a sneer. Without hesitation, he grabbed Danny's arm with unnatural strength, squeezing until Danny let out a pained gasp. Hank's grip tightened, his smile widening in a grotesque, hollow parody of joy. "Let go of me, Hank," Danny cried, struggling to pull away, but Hank's fingers dug deeper, almost inhumanly strong. Tom leaped forward, grabbing a bottle from the bar and smashing it over Hank's head. The glass shattered, but Hank didn't even flinch. His empty eyes flicked to Tom, the faintest hint of amusement on his face. Hank loosened his grip on Danny, who stumbled back, clutching his arm in shock. "Hank! Stop!" Tom shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "This isn't you!" But it was no use. Hank took a step toward Tom, his smile widening. "It is me, Tommy. I feel more alive than ever." His voice dripped with a twisted sort of euphoria, but it was hollow, like someone reciting lines they didn't understand. His words carried no meaning, just noise. Tom backed up, feeling the cold wall of the speakeasy behind him. The other patrons had begun to scramble, pushing toward the door, the chaotic sounds of panic rising as the realization of what had happened spread through the room. Some ran out into the night, while others froze, transfixed by the monstrous transformation of a man they once knew. And then she returned. The door to the velvet veil creaked open again, and there she was, the mysterious woman standing at the entrance, watching with cold, amused eyes. She glided into the room, her dark dress flowing around her like shadows, the brim of her hat casting her face in shadow. "You were warned," she said softly, her voice cutting through the panic. The crowd froze, her presence somehow even more terrifying than Hank's transformation. Immortality is not a gift. It's a curse. And now, you've seen the cost. Tom's breath came fast and shallow, his mind racing. You did this, he spat, stepping forward, anger replacing his fear. You knew what would happen. You... The woman raised a hand, silencing him with a single gesture. I told you there was a price, Tom Malone. This man chose to ignore it. And now, he is no longer bound by the rules of life or death. Tom's eyes darted to Hank, who stood unnaturally still, his smile frozen in that terrible, empty grin. You call this immortality? He's a shell, a monster. The witch's lips curved into a smile. He will live forever. His body will never age. His strength will never fade. But his soul... She paused, her eyes gleaming with dark satisfaction. That is the price. His soul belongs to me now, just as all who drink my brew will eventually find themselves hollow. The room went silent, save for the ragged breathing of those who hadn't yet fled. Tom's mind raced as he stared at Hank, at the empty vessel he had become. The witch's words echoed in his head. The soul is the price. Take it back, Tom growled, his voice low with fury. Fix him. The witch tilted her head as though considering his demand. Once the brew is taken, there is no going back. The deal is done. His fate is sealed. Tom's heart sank. He had failed. There was no way to undo this. Hank and anyone else who took the witch's brew was doomed. But as the witch turned to leave, her eyes flicked toward Tom, and a chilling smile crept across her lips. The hour strikes soon, Tom Malone. I'll see you again, when your time comes. With that, she disappeared into the night, leaving only fear and madness in her wake. The old grandfather clock in the corner of the velvet veil struck 12 with a deep, resonant chime. Each strike echoed through the silent room, amplifying the dread that had already settled over Tom's shoulders like a cold, wet blanket. Midnight had come, and with it, the witch's final promise. The few patrons who hadn't fled stood in the far corners, their faces pale with fear. Danny, nursing his bruised arm, stayed by the bar, his bravado shattered. Tom looked at them all, a sinking feeling taking hold in his chest. The witch was right. The moment Hank took that drink, there was no going back. Whatever hope they'd had of escaping this nightmare was quickly slipping away, like sand through a clenched fist. Hank stood motionless in the center of the room, his youthful face a grotesque mockery of what he had been. His empty eyes reflected nothing but the flickering candlelight, and that same eerie smile remained plastered across his lips, like a mask. Tom could barely stand to look at him anymore, but he knew he had no choice. This wasn't over. Not yet. The witch's words repeated in his mind. The hour strikes soon, Tom Malone. I'll see you again, when your time comes. He didn't know what that meant, but he wasn't going to wait around to find out. He had to do something, anything, to stop this before it consumed them all. But what could he do against something so unnatural, so powerful? Tom had dealt with tough characters before. Gangsters, thugs, men with blood on their hands. But this was different. This was evil in its purest form. He needed answers, and fast. Tom approached Danny, who looked up at him with bloodshot eyes, still cradling his arm. Danny, we gotta find her. That witch. She's the only one who can stop this. Danny shook his head, his voice trembling. Are you crazy, Tom? You saw what she did. There's no stopping her. We're all damned. Tom grabbed him by the collar, pulling him close. We don't have a choice. Hank's gone. And if we let this go on, more people are gonna end up like him. You think the cops are gonna believe this? You think anyone outside this place is gonna care what happened? This is on us, Danny. We have to make it right. Danny's eyes darted to Hank's motionless figure, then back to Tom. His fear was palpable, but so was the weight of the situation. Slowly, he nodded. All right. But how do we find her? She just disappeared. Tom let go of Danny, running a hand through his hair, thinking. The witch wasn't going to come to them. She'd made her offer, and they had taken the bait. Now she was watching from the shadows, waiting for the final piece of her twisted plan to fall into place. No, Tom realized. If they were going to end this, they'd have to draw her out. His eyes flicked to the shattered vial on the floor, the remnants of the witch's brew glistening in the dim light. There was still a way to lure her in, a way to force her hand. I need you to round up whoever's left in here, Tom said, his voice steady. We're gonna take a vote. Danny frowned. A vote? For what? Tom's face was grim as he replied. For who's willing to take the next sip? The color drained from Danny's face. You can't be serious, Tom. We already saw what happened to Hank. Tom met his gaze, the weight of his decision sinking in. I'm not asking anyone to drink it, but if we pretend like someone's about to, the witch will come back. She'll want to claim another soul. That's when we make our move. Danny opened his mouth to protest, but no words came out. He knew just as Tom did that this was the only option. It was a desperate plan, but desperation was all they had left. Within minutes, the remaining patrons had gathered around the bar, huddled together in fear and confusion. Tom explained the plan, his voice low but firm. Most were too terrified to argue, but a few, like Danny, shot him uneasy glances. They all knew the risk. They had seen what happened to Hank. As the group murmured nervously, Tom produced a second vial from behind the bar, one he had hidden earlier in the night when the witch had first made her offer. It was a bluff, but it looked convincing enough. Who's gonna do it? Someone asked from the back of the group, their voice trembling. Tom stepped forward, holding the vial up for everyone to see. I'll do it, he said, his heart pounding in his chest. I'll take the next sip. The crowd gasped, but Tom's expression remained resolute. He wasn't actually going to drink it, but the act had to be believable. He glanced at the clock again. It was 5 minutes past midnight. If the witch was watching, she would know what he was about to do. He raised the vial to his lips, his hand trembling slightly as he made the motion. The room fell into a tense, suffocating silence. Then, the door to the speakeasy creaked open. Tom froze, his pulse quickening as the witch stepped through the entrance once again, her dark silhouette framed by the smoky haze. Her smile was as cold as ever, her eyes gleaming with the promise of something far worse than death. You've chosen wisely, Tom Malone, she said, her voice dripping with mock approval. But know this, once you drink, you can never go back. Tom locked eyes with her, the vial still raised. His breath was steady now, his resolve hardening. He didn't plan to drink, but he was ready for a fight. Because tonight, either the witch would break her curse, or they'd all go down together.